My mother died back in 1998. That was the same year that both Morrison's and Woolworth's finally went out of business. And that's probably all for the best, because I don't think my mother could have lived without either of those hallowed institutions in her life. Morrison's and Woolworth's are both very important to the story of my mother and the laws of physics. I didn't actually witness this incident, only the aftermath, and I heard the story. It's pretty funny and pretty horrific. I was at a corporate dinner, stuffy corporate dinner downtown for a new job. It was Friday evening. My mother had come into town, and on Saturday, as a family, we were all going to travel up to Highlands, North Carolina. It was October, and we were going to go be leaf lookers. So my husband was charged with entertaining my mother and my 2.5-year-old son for the evening by, of course, taking them to Morrison's, followed by her, every time she visited Atlanta, trip to Woolworth's to see if she needed anything for her stash. So they went to Morrison's, and for those of you of a certain age, you will remember Morrison's for all of those red foods at the beginning of the cafeteria line. You will remember the overdone brown meat, the wonderful little round potatoes, lots of parsley on everything, and the serving of organ meats like liver long after it was politically incorrect to serve them. But yes, my mother did so love Morrison's. So after a leisurely dinner at Morrison's on North Druid Hills Road, they made their way over to the Woolworths at North DeKalb. My mother looked over the whole store for anything she might possibly want. And closing time came, but she was shopping, and the people at Woolworths were glad to have her in there. There's a reason it closed, remember? One of the things my mother loved were those little packages of Max Factor powder, the ones with the Art Deco print on them that have not changed between 1925 and this day. She loved bra strap pads, and then her absolute favorite, Final Net hairspray. You all remember Final Net hairspray, especially those of you who had mothers like mine who were helmet heads. As long as I can remember, my mother looked as if she could screw her head off at night and just sit it on the dresser and put it back on the next morning because her hair was so stiff. There's no reason anybody would want to touch that hair. And it was all kept in place by Final Net hairspray. And Woolworth's was one of the last places in this world that she could find Final Net. So she always stocked up when she came to Atlanta. So this particular evening, she had bought Final Net hairspray, among other things, and it was about 9:15 when they left the mall. And so, of course, theirs was the last car in the parking lot. They came out from Woolworth's, and they stepped off of the curb, and there was one single large truck driving far away at the perimeter. Now, if my mother had stopped to consider the laws of mathematics, she would have realized that if rate multiplied by time equals distance, there is absolutely no way that my son and that truck could possibly make contact with one another. But when my mother gets overprotective, she's not rational. She's not rational at all, and this was one of those moments. An object in motion tends to remain in motion. An object at rest tends to remain at rest. And this is true for everything except chipmunks and 2-year-olds. You ever notice how a chipmunk will run and then all of a sudden they'll stop and they'll pop that little tail up like a spoiler? Well, I've always felt that 2-year-olds reminded me of chipmunks. And so as my son stepped off the curb to go to the car, he decided he was going to take off running. Now my son's 2.5, he's about 35 pounds, 2.5 feet tall. My mother is 5'2", 135 pounds, late 60s. She takes off after him. Well, my son, being a 2-year-old, like a chipmunk, stops all of a sudden. My mother, being highly motivated, which doesn't figure anywhere in the physics calculation, can't stop. So while my son is standing there completely unsuspecting, and my husband is witnessing all of this in horror without being able to do a thing about it. My mother runs over her grandchild. Now, she realized what she was about to do, and so in order not to flatten him completely, she made a grandmother parachute out of herself. And for her effort, she was rewarded with those sort of thin, very painful and easily infected scrapes on the heels of both hands and both knees. My husband went and picked both of them up, my severely injured mother and my slightly injured and absolutely terrified and traumatized 2.5-year-old son. He picks them up, and my son is crying, of course, and my husband is looking at him and making sure he doesn't have any scrapes or broken bones, and he puts his left hand behind my son's head, and when he takes it away, he realizes there's blood on his hand, but he can't see any way in which my son is injured or how he got injured. Anyway, he takes them both to the emergency room where they spent the next 2 hours of this very memorable Friday evening. And my mother ends up with bandages around her hands and big gauze pads on each knee, which she got to sport for the weekend in Highlands. It was very attractive. And my son, they found a cut in the back of his head, and so they put some surgical adhesive on it, and they took 2 pieces of his hair and they tied a knot in it, as opposed to doing an unanesthetized set of stitches in his head. So time passed, my mother went home, her wounds healed, the knots fell out of my son's hair, his cut healed. About 6 months later, he put his finger up in his head and he said, "Mommy, I have this weird bump in my head." And I looked at this bump. My son is now 25 and there's no hair growing there to this day. And I noticed that the shape and size of that cut just exactly resembled the bottom edge of a can of Final Net hairspray.